Seeing is believing. Aristotle was looking out at sea. A sailing ship appeared on the horizon. Aristotle said, "I see the sail of the ship, but I do not see the ship itself." After an hour passed, Aristotle said, "Now I see the whole ship. If I were standing on a curved surface, the same curved surface that the ship is sailing on, but I was located at one end of the curved surface and the ship was located at the other end, then, when the ship appeared on the horizon, I would see only the sail, because the hump of the arc between us would block my view of the whole ship. But as the ship closes the distance between us, the hump of the arc would appear to flatten out, so that I could see the rest of the ship. The surface of the earth, then, may be curved rather than flat, and the earth form a sphere, not a flat plane. The shorter distance between me and the ship, however, the flatter the arc of the earth's surface would appear. That's why people think the earth is flat, but I suspect the earth is round. That night a lunar eclipse occurred. Aristotle knew that during a lunar eclipse, sun, earth, and moon lie in a straight line. The earth is between the sun and the moon, so that the sun shining on the earth causes the earth to cast a shadow which falls across the moon. Aristotle said, "The shadow that creeps across the moon is cast by the earth, but the edge of the shadow is curved. If the edge of the shadow is curved, the object which casts the shadow must also be curved. In this case, the object which casts the shadow is the earth. Therefore, the surface of the earth must be curved. Hence, the earth is a sphere, not a flat plane." Seeing is believing. Aristotle couldn't leave the earth in order to see with his own eyes that the earth is round, but he saw enough to infer that it is. But how much do you have to see in order to believe? But how much do you have to see in order to believe? Furthermore, is it possible to believe without seeing? For example, suppose I wish to know which is more likely to be true, whether the space which contains all the planets and stars and beyond is finite, that is, that it has a boundary beyond which one cannot go, or whether space is infinite, that is, that space goes on forever. Now I know space exists. Otherwise, how can I explain the empty space between my hand extended in front of me and my nose? As to the distance between my hand and the moon, is it the same kind of space that separates my hand from my nose, or is the space between my hand and the moon different? Since I can definitely see the moon and definitely see my hand, the space that lies between me and my hand and the space that lies between my hand and the moon must be the same kind of space, a transparent space, however far it stretches. Even if it stretches out of sight? But if seeing is believing, what should I believe about the space that stretches beyond the stars, a space which I cannot possibly see? Is it finite or infinite? What if I imagine I see something? Should I believe what I imagine I see? Hardly, because whether I imagine I see something or imagine I don't see it depends on me, not on whether the object is actually there or not. However, if it's possible for me to prove that there's no way for the object to be there, even if I assume that it is, in other words, prove that I cannot imagine it to be there without contradicting myself, is the likelihood increased that the object is not there? I don't know. Let's see. Suppose I assume that space comes to an end, that space has a boundary. Then I can stand at the boundary and throw a spear beyond it, watching it fly through a space that extends beyond the boundary of space, a sighting which contradicts my assumption that space comes to an end. Therefore, space is more likely to be infinite than finite, since it's impossible for me to imagine that space is finite. But what if something exceptional occurs, you ask? What if the spear I throw disappears, poof, without a trace, as it crosses the boundary of space? And not only the spear, but any and every object I choose to throw. What if all the objects disappear beyond the boundary of space? In other words, what if the boundary of space is different from the boundary that separates adjacent plots of land here on Earth? I answer your objection this way. Once you admit that the space between your hand and your nose is the same kind of space as that between your hand and the moon, and likewise the same kind as the space beyond the stars, you can't suddenly change the nature of space at its boundary to suit your argument and hope to be convincing. Unless, of course, the nature of space really does change at the boundary, but I'd have to see it to believe it. I'd like to add something here on behalf of the imagination. Restating your objection, but how do I know, since I cannot see them, that the farthest reaches of space don't screech to a halt and space come to an end? I answer this way. Suppose I try to imagine I see space come to an end. However, when I cannot imagine what I'm supposed to see, namely the boundary which space must have for it to be finite, without imagining what I'm not supposed to see, namely that space stretches beyond the boundary, I dismiss my assumption that space is finite as false. For by definition, a boundary is the line where two facing sides join, so that a one-sided boundary, a contradiction in terms, is impossible for me to imagine. Suppose, however, that contradiction notwithstanding, the one-sided boundary where space presumably ends is too extraordinary to be imagined. Then, since I cannot imagine how space bounded on one side might look, either I humble myself before the unknown, thereby rendering my imagination inoperative, although by doing so I run the risk of stultifying it, by imagining it incapable of imagining reality. Or I assume that space is infinite, a notion which exonerates imagination instead of vanquishing it. So the question, is space infinite or finite, boils down to this. Do I wish to exonerate my imagination by believing that when it contradicts itself, it's telling me no longer to pursue the train of thought that led to the contradiction, and that if there's another alternative, and only one other, to consider the other alternative true? Or do I wish to vanquish my imagination by overriding the contradiction that it presents to me? Seeing is believing, but if I can't be there to see what's happening, but I can imagine that if I were there, what others, some of the top physicists in the world, say is happening, namely that space is finite, can't possibly be happening, who should I believe, me or them? Even if I go with my own intuition, I must admit I feel somewhat bewitched that I can't wrap my imagination around infinite space. I mean, no God could have created it, the reason being that an infinite space does not stand in need of creation, since it has always been there, and therefore requires no beginning. Consequently, there's no one to blame or to thank for it. Nor can it possibly be purposeful, since if it were, it would have to alter its nature in order finally to become what it was intended to be. But the idea of an infinite space coming to a conclusion in order to continue as something else is simply beyond my power, and I believe anyone's power, to imagine. In short, I am possessed of a perplexity whose unraveling is inconceivable. Infinite space fills me with a sense of wonder that at the same time is both irresistible and irksome. A sense of wonder irresistible because I am suspended in it, and so I must take its infinity personally. Irksome because unable to make anything of it, it promises no practical result. Infinite space has none except truth value. It is too impersonal to pray to, and considering its infinity, too awesome to dismiss as accidental. In short, infinite space has made an immaterialist of me. That is, one who believes there's more to nature than meets the eye, although what it is always out of sight. Once again, let me back up before moving forward. Since I cannot imagine space ending without imagining more space beyond, I assume that space is infinite. Furthermore, since infinite space must have always been there, where was space while it was waiting to begin, time also must be infinite. Now, when I say time, I really mean that the transformations of physical matter which time measures, that is, which occur in time, on time, all the time, continue forever. That is, that the intertwined chains of cause and effect which compose the physical universe are also without beginning or end. Otherwise, I must assume that there was a time before the physical universe began to exist when it didn't exist. But if so, the physical universe must have arisen from nothing. But can something come from nothing? If it can, at exactly what point does nothing become something? At no point, since it is as impossible for something to come from nothing as it is inevitable that something comes from something. Therefore, as with infinite space, once again I am driven to believe the contrary to what I cannot imagine without contradiction, namely, that the chains of cause and effect that compose the material universe are without beginning or end. Without beginning. The unbroken succession of my breaths from birth to death presuppose the embryonic development of lungs, and in turn presuppose conceivers of the embryo, and in turn the conception of the conceivers, and in turn fast rewinding. The inorganic elements that evolved organically, and in turn the Big Bang that reprogrammed the matter that pre-existed it, and in turn the build-up to the Big Bang, and in turn the build-up to the build-up, and in turn ad infinitum. And the causal chain without end. The last breath followed by the decay of the corpse into elemental matter, the dispersal of matter for aeons without end, until its reconfiguration and transformation as part of the build-up to the next Big Bang, or as part of the breakdown to the next big crush. In other words, there is no first cause or final effect. Matter evolves, devolves, revolves, involves forever, without origin or goal. Although intervals between cause and effect may differ as instants from aeons, every effect is both at the same time the result of a preceding cause and the cause of a subsequent effect. In short, we are dealing here with an internally coherent system whose coherence, because it is without end and therefore never concludes, is without purpose. Since inorganic chains of physical transformation contain links which connect mechanically and predictably to each other, predictability of the connections makes science possible. Organic causal chains, on the other hand, contain links which have some freedom of response. In fact, the more freedom, the less predictable, and hence the more scientifically challenging. My body cannot be other than it is given its physical and physiological preconditions. But I can choose to move my body to the left or to the right. I can take a job in Los Angeles or in Philadelphia. Within strict limits, like a worm inching forwards or backwards, I am free to redirect the causal chain of which my body is an inseparable part. Now here's my point. If the chain of cause and effect that produced me aimed at a final goal, then this final goal would condition, would superimpose itself on my choices, limit my choices to those which move me closer to the goal, closer even to a goal of which I am unaware or destined never to attain. Accordingly, if the goal dictates my responses, my freedom to respond is curtailed. Conversely, the very infinity of these endless, goalless, causal chains assures my freedom, and the freedom of others, to create goals which affect us alone. Metal filings attracted to a magnet will never assemble together into a configuration of their own choosing. But if each filing was a body capable of choosing which area of the magnet it found most attractive, perhaps because it found the filings already gathered there more compelling than others gathered elsewhere on the magnet, then irresistibly drawn to the magnet all the filings would be, but the manner of assembling would be determined by them. Because of the purposelessness of the infinity in which we are embedded, we humans are free to submit ourselves to a society of our own choice, whether to a meritocratic society driven by capitalism or to an egalitarian one whose dynamic is communistic. But in the process of submission, we should be wary of committing ourselves, if only we had known, to an early stage of social development, however technologically advanced, to the point that we idealize instead of expose its primitiveness and move on to something more civilized. And indeed, the meritocracy funded by capitalism is just such a primitive social organization for this very reason, because it assigns individuals different degrees of freedom according to fortune, according, that is, not just to money, but to the inscrutable power associated with nature that endows individuals with different capabilities, which in turn qualifies or disqualifies them from leading enviable lives. This is nothing but primitive fortune worship, flouncing around in a robe of justice. We need to move beyond nature into the strictly human domain of fairness. Fairness being a man-made as distinct from natural virtue, a virtue that comes from the heart as well as the head, that fulfills our potential to create a freely chosen society, rather than one that nature serves up to us, take it or leave it. For instance, consider the need for social recognition. Currently, the more talent a person possesses, or the more capable he or she is, the greater the recognition he or she deserves, as if recognition of individual merit were the purpose of being celebrated. But that, in my opinion, is a very primitive level of recognition compared to recognizing each other as equal participants in the creation of a global society, which, however different the contribution of each, is owned in common by all on an equal basis. And I'm not just talking about money. On the spiritual plane, universal recognition is recognition of each other as the transient residents of infinite space, as the spellbound embodiments of infinite chains of cause and effect that proceed without purpose, except as we gather them under one roof, which we call home. Except as we recognize each other as several billion variations of the same anonymous celebrity whom we created as much as it created us. Universal recognition, which includes all of us, is, I believe, an advance over individual recognition, which excludes all but one of us. In the same way that a world at peace, however mundane its day-to-day operation, is more civilized than a world at war, however impressive its arsenal of destruction. But to return to science, since my primordial ancestors believed, as I do myself and for the same reason, that the sky never ends, or, as I have learned to express the same idea, that space is infinite, the reason being, as I argue above, that they, like I, could not imagine space coming to an end without imagining more space beyond, they thought to provide, since they could not imagine space coming to an end without imagining more space beyond, they thought to provide space with an infinite ground floor which was necessarily flat. Therefore, in spite of indications of its curvature, they held on tenaciously to the notion not only that the earth is flat, but, as the senses seem to confirm, erroneously in this case, that it is also infinite. Moreover, I picture them as reasoning that space does not require a creation for it to begin to be, since it always was and always would be. For the principle from nothing comes nothing made better sense to them than from nothing comes something. Therefore, the God of my ancestors was not required to create a universe in order to prove, as with us, 1, that he exists, 2, that he is no slacker, and 3, that he is not a woman. Like space and time, the God of my ancestors was infinite and therefore beyond imagining. Therefore, as much as they wanted to believe in God, the very fact of his inconceivability caused them to despair of belief, since they were certain that being infinite, no image could adequately represent him. And so they decided that if there was a God, despair of belief in him was what he required of his faithful. Despair of belief, then, they held to be the mark of true faith. And since all equally despaired, they ridiculed the notion of one person despairing more than another, they founded an egalitarian society. All this happened before the Great Famine, which kicked off history as we know it. Now, while dumbfoundedness, which infinity inspires in those who contemplate it, is the true basis of spirituality, because it extinguishes thought at the same time as it inflames it, this dumbfounded state of mind is anathema to the scientific community. For scientists must solve dilemmas, not be transported by them. Otherwise, they won't be paid. Furthermore, the object of science must be finite, 1, for it to be measurable, and 2, for it to be useful. What about Copernicus, you object? Didn't he cherish infinity? Didn't he declare as part of his heliocentric theory that space is infinite? Yes, he did. But Copernicus was less impressed with the infinity of space than with its fixity. According to the estimation of the senses, he argued, the earth is, in respect to the sky, as a point to a body, and a finite to an infinite magnitude. Grant Macaulay comments in Nicholas Copernicus and an Infinite Universe in Popular Astrology, Volume 44, Number 10, December 1936. This comparison of point to body is definitely conventional, but finite to infinite is quite the contrary. It is astonishing. It is astonishing, then, says Copernicus, that instead of the small earth, the vastness of heaven is able to rotate in the space of 24 hours. Unquote. Macaulay continues. As we have noted above, Copernicus has said that it is an axiom of physics that what is infinite cannot be moved. In Chapter 10 of Book 1, De Ordine Caelestium Orbium, on the arrangement of the celestial orbits, he employs this axiom in support of the system of the universe which he is developing. Prima et suprema omnium est stellarum fixarum sphera, se ipsam et omnia continens, idioque immobilis. First and above all is the sphere of the fixed stars, containing itself and all, and for that reason immobile. Unquote. What is infinite cannot be moved, asserts the quoted axiom. For the reason that it contains all things, The sphere of the fixed stars cannot be moved, says Copernicus. For if the sphere that contains all things, that is, if infinite space were itself in motion, then infinite space would be contained by a still more infinite space at rest. But if the containing space were likewise in motion, then it would be contained by a still greater infinite space, and that by another ad infinitum. In order to avoid this infinite regress of infinite spaces, 16th century physicists established the axiom that what is infinite may neither be traversed nor moved. To continue the quote from Popular Astrology. The immobility of this all-containing sphere, in effect the universe, is thus proved by its infinity. This axiom, namely that what is infinite cannot be moved, as Kepler mentions later, was of high authority, and were heaven shown to be infinite, would become a powerful proof of the rotation of the earth. Unquote. Rather than being an enthusiast of infinity, Copernicus simply used it to prove his point that the earth rotates and not the heavens, which, being infinite, is fixed in place. Copernicus would have agreed with the recent author of A Brief History of the Universe, www.thebigview.com, that, quote, infinity is rather an unfathomable conception, unquote, and let it go at that. But so unfathomable is it that infinity is an embarrassment to both religion and science. To religion, because no apostle can form an image, however revelatory, of the unimaginable. To science, because no Nobel laureate can measure the unmeasurable. Both religion and science require a finite universe. The Church, lest an infinite one escape accountability by its creator. Science, because in order to conduct experiments and draw conclusions about them, one must imagine the universe to fit into a laboratory where variables are controllable. In retrospect, both religion and science are seen to work in a cataclysmic medium. The God of the one, rather a tortoise in comparison with the other, executing the creation in 7 days, the other establishing a new world's record for creation of a universe by big banging space and time in, quote, an incomprehensibly small fraction of a second, unquote. The Church put its reputation on the line by predicting an end of the world, which never came. Science predicted that an atomic bomb could destroy a city or two. So science, with characteristic modesty, won the competition by making good on its promise of destruction. According to the author of The Big View, physicists dispense with infinity altogether, or invoke it as a last resort to prevent their theories from going belly up. The latter was the case with Newton. Quote, Newton postulated the law of universal gravitation that applied to all bodies, whether in space or on Earth, and he supplied the mathematical foundation for it. According to Newton, bodies attract each other proportionately with their size and inverse proportionately with the square of the distance between them. Unfortunately, one consequence of this theory is that the stars of the universe attract each other and thus must eventually collapse into each other. Newton was not able to give a plausible explanation for why this did not happen. To counter this paradox, it was inferred that the universe is infinite in space and thus contains an infinite number of evenly distributed stars, which would, on the whole, create a gravitational equilibrium. Unquote. With Newton, then, infinity becomes purposeful. It's there to ensure gravitational equilibrium. Fast forward to the 20th century. Once again, the author of The Big View, quote, it appears that modern cosmology has answered the above question, whether the universe has boundaries in time and space. The universe we can observe is finite. It has a beginning in space and time, before which the concept of space and time has no meaning, because space-time itself is a property of the universe. According to the Big Bang Theory, the universe began about 12 to 15 billion years ago in a violent explosion. For an incomprehensibly small fraction of a second, the universe was infinitely dense and an infinitely hot fireball. Unquote. Let's pause here, even at the risk of getting singed. I note that the universe has usurped the place of space as an ultimate container. The word universe implies that whatever is there, and however much of it is present, is verged into one universe. The Church downsized infinite space to fit into a Godhead. Science cages it in a universe. Moreover, the caged bird, its wings clipped, deprived of its quality of endlessness, becomes a characteristic of the cage. Quote, space-time itself is a property of the universe. Unquote. I note also that the writer speaks now of a universe, quote, we can observe, unquote, as if the universe were a gated community beyond which lies indiscriminate, trackless ghetto. Next, I note that infinity is no longer a noun, but an adverb with a change of meaning from bona fide endlessness to being beyond the ability of anyone to measure it. Quote, an infinitely dense and infinitely hot fireball. Unquote. Finally, as the universe expands, it defies logic by creating out of itself the additional space needed to contain it, and thus falls prey to the Groucho paradox. Quote, hello, room service? Send up a bigger room. Unquote. Owing to the prestige of modern physics, the theoretical model it offers here commands authority, rivaling that formerly wielded by the medieval church. Consequently, the scientist who refuses to surrender his or her imagination to the authorities is denied the privilege of operating a train of thought in public. Turn around, touch the ground, and freeze, a voice commands the newly dead. Whoever moves goes straight to hell.